Good evening, and thank you for joining us on this, our last night of this study that we've been going through in the story of the Bible. To do this, we've been using the popular 17 time periods of the Bible, and that's a kind of a schedule, a list that someone else has created. We're just adapting it for our purposes so we can see from beginning to end that the Bible is one story and has a number of different themes running through it, but it's not like just 66 different books in a collection. It is, in fact, one story from beginning to end, and we'll kind of emphasize that at the end of this lesson tonight. We've been working through this list, and we are on the last one, Letters to Christians. You open up your New Testament and you see the first four Gospels. You see the book of Acts, which Ken covered for us last week. And then the rest of it is really just a bunch of letters and personal letters, some letters to churches, some letters to individuals. And so we put all those in this grouping for this evening, and we'll just very quickly walk through these, kind of summarize some of these things. Some will have a bigger summary than others, and then we will wrap up our study of the story of the Bible and these 17 time periods. To help us finish this out tonight, Ken Chapman is here from Orlando, Florida. Ken, how are you doing tonight?
Doing good, Jonathan. I've enjoyed these studies and being with you on these Monday nights. And for the last time, I would encourage our viewers to maybe put to memory these 17 Bible time periods, or at a minimum, maybe print them out and put them in the back of your Bible so that you can consult them from time to time. It helps you to be able to place a story or an event or a character where they fit in the timeline, and helps you kind of understand how it fits into the story of the Bible. But I've enjoyed the study. Hope our viewers have. And like I said, just enjoyed spending time with you.
Well, with that in mind, why don't we just go ahead and get started? We're on period 17, the last one, Letters to Christians. And when you close the book of Acts, you open the book of Romans. And I think some of this organization is helpful just because Acts ends with Paul as kind of the main character. And so we start with the Pauline epistles. Ken, is it Pauline or Pauline? I hear both ways. How do you say it?
I usually say Pauline just because Pauline sounds like somebody's aunt. So
that's true. That's true. Well, and typically as we teach it, that's a magic E on the end, which makes you say the letter of the vowel. So it should be Pauline. But anyway, it doesn't matter. We could save this whole discussion and say Paul's epistles. And not worry about it. Well, you open up, you got Romans. You have the big three kind of. You start with Romans, 1st, 2nd Corinthians. And Romans, I'm convinced, is one of the most difficult books of the New Testament just because of the theological depth. And in this book, I guess maybe the best way to summarize it is that it's God's plan of salvation, God's plan to save Jew and Gentile through Christ. And what we see there is the gospel. Now, there's a lot more to it, obviously, than that. There's a number of different things he covers. But I think we see just kind of the basis, maybe Paul's dissertation for his doctorate in theology or something here. And Ken, I'm just going to kind of roll through these. You just let me know when you have a comment or a disagreement or something. We only have time just to make a couple of sentences worth of comments on each of these. So I'm just going to start rolling, and you stop me when the Spirit moves you, I guess. 1 Corinthians, I think we all know 1 Corinthians fairly well because of the relationship between Paul and the church in Corinth. It was a troubled relationship, and that church had some troubles. And so we have this letter correcting some doctrine and behavior. He had gotten word about them from themselves and then from Chloe's household. And there's some things he needs to correct. And as an apostle, as one authorized from God, he has the authority to set these things straight. And that's what he does in this letter. And then he has to write back to them. I have a feeling Ken will make some comments here. He loves 2 Corinthians. We studied that last year. But he has to write back to them because some people have come in kind of maybe besmirching Paul, mocking him a little bit for the way he went about some things. And so Paul has to write them, and he defends his apostleship for the purpose of defending his teaching. Paul is not concerned with himself. He is concerned with what he's taught, though, because that comes straight from God. And so as far as that affects him as a person, that's how he defends himself. And so Ken's already raising his hand. He's ready to go on 2 Corinthians.
You're right. I can't restrain myself from this, but these two epistles, of course, we have a few of these, as you're going to note as you go through the two-part epistles. And this is certainly a sequel to the first epistle. And, many times we think of the church at Corinth, because of the problems in that first letter, as a bad church. But I think if you take both of them together, you have to come to the conclusion the church at Corinth was a good church. First of all, they reached out to Paul and said, hey, help, we've got problems. And then the first part of 2 Corinthians, Paul is really just applauding them, said, good job. You cleaned those things up. Now, you still got some troublemakers there, as you say, that he deals with in the last half of the book. And so Paul has to defend his apostleship, maybe gets on to even the good crowd a little bit for not defending him themselves. But we get a lot of insight, maybe more so than any of the other New Testament churches. We know about the church at Corinth. Yes. We feel like we intimately know them, the good and the bad.
Right. Yeah. But most of us probably would have started an East Side church in Corinth after having read this a little bit. All right. There's more Pauline epistles. We have Galatians, which shares a lot of similarities with the book of Romans. It's much smaller, but really Paul's tone is very different in Galatians than it is in Romans. Paul's upset in Galatians. We read Corinthians and we think, wow, Paul's angry. No, Paul's really angry in Galatians, because not just that some things have misunderstood, but they've changed the gospel, and he lays down a heavy rebuke and even really a condemnation to those who would change the gospel.
Yeah, we could subtitle Galatians as Romans for Dummies.
Well, that's funny, because I've done some sermons like this, and that's what I've said is Romans Junior, if you will. Yeah, you're exactly right, and we can make the same point with a couple of these next ones as well. Ephesians, just a heralded epistle. Everybody loves Ephesians, I think. But I think maybe a good underlying summary is the ascended Christ. He's on his throne, and his body, the church. If you're going to put a one sentence summary on it, I think that's about the best you can do with Ephesians. There's a number of things to talk about, but that gets at the heart of what's going on, Christ and his body. You have Philippians, and obviously we're just running through these canonically. We're not doing these chronologically. If we had been doing that, we might have covered some of this in Acts as Paul is writing as he journeys. But in Philippians, we have a personal letter of thanks and encouragement. One of the key words in the book or in the letter to the Philippians is the word joy or rejoice. And it's a very upbeat letter. There's a couple of things over in chapter 3 he gets a little strong about, but for the most part, it's just a kind of a friendly letter of encouragement and thanks. And then we have Colossians, and Ken, at first I had Ephesians for the Colossians as the summary here. If you read these two together, they are very similar. A lot of overlap. Ephesians is a little bit longer, but I think Colossians has a little bit of a different focus. We talk about the incomparable Christ, or maybe that's just a way to have the two epistles separately. We shouldn't be too surprised that he writes two similar letters, but then sends them to different people. Ken, it's funny, there's a lot of discussion in the scholarly world about the authorship of these two letters. And it's funny that some will argue, well, Paul couldn't have written Ephesians because it's too similar to Colossians. And then a whole nother group will argue, well, Paul couldn't have written Colossians because it's too similar to Ephesians. And it's like, well, you got to pick one or the other here.
There is so-called scholarship in a nutshell. right
That's
there.
right. Yes. Yes. That's right. That's exactly right. All right. We got a couple more. I put these on their own slide just because they're pretty different as Paul deals with, Ken, are you ready for this? Eschatological issues. And that just the things of the last days is all that means. You'll read the word eschatology a lot in commentaries. I'm so sick of that word. Everything is eschatological. All that means is the end of time.
I noticed you didn't put that on the slide. Is that because you couldn't spell it?
That's right. Yes.
Okay.
You caught me. You caught me. Right. You have this, we talk about Philippians being a personal letter. Listen, First Thessalonians is a very personal letter. Paul had a great relationship with this group, and he's actually kind of lamenting that he couldn't have spent more time there. He got ran out of town, if you'll remember. And he writes them to praise them for how well they're doing. He's almost pleasantly surprised at some things. Keep doing what you're doing, he says. You're doing a great job. And then he writes some things about the return of Jesus, when that's going to happen, how we don't know when that's going to happen. And Ken, I know this is that the chapter divisions are ours, that Paul didn't write in chapters. But it's interesting that pretty much at the end of every chapter, you could argue in 1st and 2nd Corinthians, there is something about the return of Jesus Christ at the end of every chapter. And so kind of makes for a nice division, maybe even a nice sermon to summarize those two. Well, then he has to write 2nd Thessalonians because it seems that some people had misunderstood what Paul had said. So he's going to have to clear some things up. It seems that some of the Thessalonians thought Paul meant Jesus is coming back now. So they just kind of stopped living life, stopped working. And no, that's not what I'm saying, Paul says. Here are some things that have to happen first. So get back to work and be ready for when the time does come, whenever that may be. Two probably a little overlooked letters when it comes to the Pauline corpus there. There's another good scholarly word. All right, then we have the pastoral epistles, as they're often referred to. That's 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, and Titus. And, we often group 1 Timothy and 2 Timothy, and that's actually not the right grouping, really. 1 Timothy and Titus are the two that are most similar, as Paul is writing these letters to these young preachers, specifically about their work, the church. Right there, smack dab in the middle of 1 Timothy, he says, so that you know how to behave yourselves in the church, in the house of the Lord. And so about the work of a young preacher in 1 Timothy and Titus. And because we're going in canonical order, 2 Timothy is more of a personal letter, just some final words to his friend, his brother in Christ, a fellow preacher, and his student. Someone that's been sitting at his feet. And when I read, I don't know about you, Ken, but when I read 2 Timothy, I can get a little bit of emotional, because we know Paul's in prison. We know the end is coming. And what is so important at this time, these are the last words from Paul to Timothy, at least in written format that we have. So you get what's really important here. And then we have that letter to Titus. Titus is working on the island of Crete. And so it's kind of Timothy's version of Titus, or Titus's version of Timothy. I guess I didn't say that right. And he spells all that out there at the first part of Titus, where I left you to do some things there. I need you to get to them.
In these three letters, you see what every old person can relate to. And that is that Paul, the old preacher, is worried about the next generation.
Yes.
Not that Timothy and Titus have given him any cause for worry necessarily, but don't give up. You keep preaching the word. Don't get caught up in this newfangled stuff. And it definitely reads like an old preacher speaking to a young preacher who's about the old preacher about to pass. You keep doing. You just preach the word. Yeah. Don't divert from that in any way. So
yeah, they're not going to be able to reach out to Paul anymore. They're not going to be able to travel with Paul anymore. And so this is kind of, the last words to help keep them going and keep them in line. Now, if you know the New Testament, you know that there is another epistle of Paul's, and I'm not going to give it its own slide. That is Philemon. And what I'm going to do is bring back up this section. We made the connection between Ephesians and Colossians, but what we also see is that Philemon would kind of go with this Colossian letter to the same area, the same location, probably sent by the same hands. And when you see commentaries, you'll often see Colossians and Philemon put together. Sometimes you'll see Ephesians, Colossians, and Philemon put together. And it's a very short letter, one of those one-chapter letters as we think about it. Philemon's slave Onesimus has run away, and it just so happened that he runs right into Paul. And Paul teaches him the gospel. Paul helps him, leads him to obey the gospel, and he sends him back to Philemon and kind of puts some pressure on Philemon in how he's treating Onesimus, how Paul could use Onesimus. And so we have a very interesting letter there. All right, that's the Pauline epistles. Ken, any comments to kind of wrap that up before we get into what's referred to as the general epistles?
Well, other than the Pauline epistles dominate the epistles, he writes far more than any other New Testament writer, and that shouldn't surprise us. He ended up dominating the book of Acts, and so this unsuspecting character becomes the dominant figure in first century Christianity. When we're first introduced to him in Acts, we never would have guessed that. But he dominates the book of Acts. He dominates the letters to the Christians. And so we're so familiar with Paul because of that dominance, and have grown to certainly love him and appreciate the work that he did for the Lord.
Well, and some of that might be, at least as far as history tells us, it doesn't seem that some of the apostles traveled quite as widespread as Paul did. Now, they did, and tradition, not the biblical record, but tradition tells us that they go to various countries and that kind of thing, but maybe not quite so much as Paul did. And some of that would be because of his role as apostle to the Gentiles. And so that would explain some of that. Yeah, I think that's a very good point to make here as we wrap up this particular group of letters. So we go to the general epistles, or Ken, I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit here. They're sometimes referred to as the Catholic epistles. What is that reference to there? Is that a reference to the Catholic Church there, or what's the idea there?
These were some of the Pope's favorite epistles. That's what. No, the word Catholic, outside of the way we normally use it, just means the universal,
right?
Epistles, and so universal in the sense that it weren't written to a specific person, always like Philemon, wasn't written to deal with a specific problem at a church like Corinth or Thessalonica.
Right. All right. So you have Hebrews, and if you'll notice in the canonical order, it comes right after Philemon. And apparently, when this order was put together, one of the reasons it was put here is because of its connection with Paul. The book of Hebrews is technically anonymous. It doesn't claim to have been written by Paul. It doesn't claim any author. But for a long time, people claimed that Paul wrote it. I don't think he did. Some do, and that's fine. I'm not sure it really matters. But it puts it right there at the end of that Pauline corpus of scripture. So you maybe have that little bit of a connection. The book of Hebrews is fabulous. It is a letter, but it's more of a sermon than anything. And it's all about the superiority of Christ. Why would you go back to the law of Moses when Jesus is better than the angels who delivered the law? when Jesus is better than Moses, who is associated with the law, when he's better than Aaron, who is the high priest of the law, when he's better than bulls and goats, who are the sacrifices under the law. Jesus is superior. Why would you go back to that other way? Ken, I feel horrible leaving Hebrews after saying that little amount of it, because so much is there. It's such a powerful letter. But again, we're not, studying Hebrews. We are kind of doing an overview. Then we have the book of James, which is probably one of the favorites of Christians. It's so practical. It's, I think I've even referenced it as Proverbs for the Christian before, as he deals with a number of different things. But I think one of the overarching things here is that single-minded devotion. Do not be double-minded. Cleanse your hands, you sinners. Purify your hearts, you double-minded. He says in the letter. Very practical and good for Christians to spend some time with, wrestling. First Peter. Hey, we finally get back to Peter. He writes to Babylon or Rome, it seems. And he writes two letters, and I'll go ahead and put them both up here because both of them are talking about maintaining faithfulness. But both of them have a little bit of a different emphasis. In First Peter, it's maintaining faithfulness despite persecution. Trouble's going to arise. Will you maintain your faith in Christ, your belief, the correct doctrine, and correct practice? And then Second Peter says that false teaching is going to come. Can you maintain your faith in the face of all of that? And then Ken, I'm cheating. I'm getting one out of order here. You and I had talked about going in the canonical order. But Jude and Second Peter 2 are so similar. And so he kind of maybe condenses First and Second Peter down into this one chapter and encourages them to maintain their faithfulness despite trouble, whether that trouble be persecution, whether it be false doctrine, whatever it may be.
Yeah, Peter and Jude would have been called into the principal's office after turning in those works because they kind of look like they copied off each other.
Right. And then I probably should have changed this. I probably should have changed the title here to the John's literature that John writes. He obviously he writes a gospel we know about, but then he writes First, Second, and Third John. And he would have been in trouble too, because Second and Third John are way short. He forgot this was Sunday night before the project was due on Monday. And oh man, I forgot what I was supposed to do. And then of course, Revelation. So we just kind of put all these on the same slide. First John seems to be even maybe responding to some growing Gnosticism, some people who thought there was special knowledge that one had to have to be right with God. And you can go through First John and focus on the idea of being with God, having this relationship with God, underline the word know, underline the word love, and you'll see how clear of a theme that is in this book. So we can have fellowship with God through love and knowledge. And that's not some kind of special knowledge that only a few people have. That's just spending time with the Lord and his word. And then again, we have these very short two epistles. We kind of had trouble summarizing these a little bit because, well, you don't need to summarize it, just read it. It's so short. So we went with abiding in the doctrine of Christ for Second John, and Third John, walking in truth. You can actually see that those are really the same thing, abiding in the doctrine of Christ. John is writing to, it seems, maybe a church. We don't exactly know what church. He calls it the elect lady. Maybe that's a specific group. And then Third John is written to someone called Gaius. We don't exactly know who these folks are, but he just kind of wants to remind them of a few things. And then we get to the book of Revelation. And no, we're not going to take the next 20 minutes and talk about the book of Revelation. We're not even going to talk about the date of the book of Revelation, which is good because Ken and I disagree about the book, but we can agree on this point, on this summary. And that's things are going to get bad. whether you're in Jerusalem or whether you're in Ephesus or wherever this is happening, whenever this is happening, whether it be in the 60s or in the 90s of that first century, the point John is making here is that things are going to get bad. Some of you are about to suffer, but God is still on his throne. I think that's why the book opens the way it does, getting the attention of these 7 churches of Asia Minor. And then in chapters 4 and 5, this great big picture of God on his throne, God in control. And so whatever happens, yes, it may hurt, it may be painful, but it's only temporary because God has this. God is on his throne. God is ruling.
I'm saying this accommodatively, but remember, when it comes to the book of Revelation, it's like we've cheated and we've read the last chapter of the book.
Yes.
We know how this story ends.
Right.
And so you might be in the middle of the book, and you might have some doubts and some questions and some tribulations yourself. But remember, you've read the last chapter. You know how this ends, and Christ is victorious, and those who are Christ are victorious. And so what a wonderful comfort that is while we're in the middle of the book.
Right. I just went completely blank. The name just jumped right out of my head, and it's kind of embarrassing. He preached at Helton Drive before you came to town. A couple of preachers before you, David Hartzell. There it is. Oh. The last name just jumped right out of my head. Have you ever heard of the way he watched Alabama football games?
I don't remember.
Nobody else would watch it like this, but he was a big Alabama fan, wound up down in Tuscaloosa, and a big Alabama fan. And he recorded the games, Ken, and he would know whether Alabama won before he ever watched the game. And his analogy to this is that they could be down by 7 with 2 minutes left and fumble the ball, and he is not concerned because he knows the final score. Again, I don't know many people that watch football like that, and maybe that was one of those preacher stories, but that's always stuck with me because you're exactly right. That's what's happening in Revelation. We know the final score, and even if there's a fumble with 2 minutes left and we're down by 7, God is still going to win. God is still going to be victorious. So there's these letters to the Christians, a lot of information there. We have done a rough summary job here, just kind of giving you a picture of what's going on in these books. But before we conclude, this is our last episode of this series, of this study, the story of the Bible, the 17 time periods. This is one story from Genesis to Revelation. It is about one thing that's happening in God's relationship with man. How can we summarize this giant book that was written by that is made up of 66 books written by some 40 men over the period of 1,500 years or so, across 3 different continents, across 3 different languages? How can you summarize something like that? And I ran into this a few years ago, and I just thought it was so helpful. And here is the story of the Bible, Ken. If we're going to summarize it to a few words: Jesus is coming, Jesus came, and Jesus is coming back. The whole Old Testament is God is creating this people to bring about a Messiah. And then we see in the New Testament that God brought a Messiah to create a people. And he's going to come back and he's going to take his people with him. And so we have this summary. Again, it's kind of a crude, short summary. But I think it's helpful to kind of know what's going on and to know what to expect. It's not just a nice story that Jesus is coming and Jesus came. No, there's some action that we must take because he's coming back. So this is not just an academic exercise. This is not just for head knowledge. It's not like there's just going to be a test when Ken and I are done and you all check your email for the exam copy here. No, that's not what we're doing. We have to make sure we respond to this the way we do, or the way we should, and be prepared for when Jesus comes back. So for myself, thank you for joining us these past 17 weeks. I hope this has been helpful, maybe just kind of making some things more concrete where they go in the story and helping us settle these things in our mind. Ken, do you have something you'd like to say here at the end?
Just thanks to all of our viewers who have watched and been with us these 17 weeks. And may God bless you in your study of the story of the Bible. Just keep studying, keep studying.
Well, hope you have a great evening. And I'm sure soon we will let you know if and what we're going to do next. And if you have any input about that, any requests, any ideas, we'll be happy to hear that from you. You can hit up Ken on his Facebook. You can hit me up and let us know. But until next time, or until the Lord comes back, we hope that you are blessed and that you give glory to God in all that you say and do. Have a great night.